I still have just a little bit of time before the wife and kids come back from the TEP vacation. And I've been once again using that time to watch movies which have been uploaded onto YouTube, which brings me today to Berkeley in the 60s, of which you can find a copy on YouTube, which I'll link to in the description down below. This is a documentary film. So it's archival footage, talking heads, archival footage, talking heads. You know how these documentaries go. But as you know, a well put together documentary can be fascinating. Uh, Talking heads give very interesting little sound bites. The archival footage shows a lot of interesting events caught on film, and in this case, a lot of confrontation between police and protesters, where the camera just caught some really interesting, interesting events. So it's if you like a good documentary, check this one out. I found it quite fascinating. This was made in 1990. Now, obviously, it's about the events in Berkeley in the 1960s. So, 1960 up to about 1969. I think they cut things off right at 1969. They don't go into Kent State or anything like that. Kent State happened in Ohio, I know, but I think the ripples were felt throughout the country. Don't go into those crazy new left groups that were in California in the 70s, like what was the one that Patty Hearst had, Sudanese Liberation Army and stuff like that. So it's just about the 1960s in Berkeley. It was shown on basic cable in the 90s, which is where I saw it in the late 90s. I don't remember which cable station it was. But there was one cable station which showed it multiple times, and I saw it a few different times back in the 1990s. So this is a rewatch for me. I don't remember how many times I saw it. I don't know. Maybe I saw it about twice in the 1990s. I may have seen it a couple more times since then, just watching copies on the internet. And I've watched clips of it multiple times. So yeah, obviously this is well. First of all, this is going to be this is not a new movie for me. I'm revisiting an old movie here, as I sometimes do on this channel, and yeah, the movie is a subject of great interest to me. So earlier this week or last week, when I was reviewing the TV movie The Sixties, which came out in 1999. I mentioned a couple different things. I mentioned the nostalgia from the 1960s, which was going on in the 1990s, which was a nostalgia created by baby boomers, but which I believe had a big effect on me and possibly other members of my generation. Uh, when I was in high school, I was vaguely interested in it. You'd hear bits and pieces dropped in conversation or mentioned in a newspaper, and I remember asking my mom, "Who's Abby Hoffman? Who are the Smothers Brothers?" Just bits and pieces you pick up and are curious about. But by the time I got into college, had become, first of all, a history nut, so I was really interested in any reading about the times before I was born. Um, but I also became a convert to student activism. I think in part because of this great nostalgia of the 1960s, and I became obsessed with this period, as I think did a few other people of my generation. And of course, too young to have lived through it. We only learned about it through documentaries like this and through books, etc. I actually I was did a number of my school papers on the New Left movement in the 1960s whenever I could find a way to tie it in. I was a history major, so I took one college course on the history of the American West. Um, and we had to write some sort of paper on a topic in the American West, and I wanted to do the Berkeley free speech movement. I mean, it was in It was in California, so it was in the West. The professor was a little bit ambivalent about doing something which he viewed as more tied to the student protest movement and not the culture of the American West. So I reworked it slightly to be the conditions leading up to the Berkeley free speech movement, talking about how radicalism in the Bay Area had been growing throughout the 50s and 60s, and then ended up with the Berkeley free speech movement in 1964. And a lot of the stuff I wrote in that paper, and I'll link to a copy of that paper in the description down below. I've put it up on one of my old blogs for anyone who's interested. But a lot of stuff I wrote in that paper is in this documentary. The protests in 1960 against the House on Un-American Committee, House on Un-American Activities Committee. The way this became a recruiting tool for the student radicals in Berkeley, the civil rights protests in the early 60s, which fed into the Berkeley free speech movement. So I had written that paper before I saw this documentary. So when the documentary was going through this stuff, it just clicked with a lot of stuff I had already read about and stuff I already knew, and it was right square in my area of interest. So the documentary is focuses on a number of issues that interested the student radicals in Berkeley in the 1960s. And it's maybe not obvious from the title, but the documentary is only about the student protests. It's not like anything else that was happening in Berkeley during the time. So you're not going to get urban planning or anything like that, but just the protest movements. And it goes through a number of them. So we start off with the House on Un-American Activity Committee's protests. Then we go to the civil rights protests. Then we go to the free speech movement protests. Then we go to the Vietnam protests. Then, somewhat confusingly, we go into the counterculture protests. Maybe I'll get to that in a moment. Then we get to the Black Panthers and their movement. Then we get to the women's movement. And then we get to People's Park. So there is a lot in there, with the consequence that any one movement is covered only very briefly. Now, the first time I watched this, if memory serves, I did not feel like anything was getting skipped over. I felt like I was getting my money's worth, where there was a fascinating documentary that was going in depth on all these different things that were happening. Rewatching it now, I get the feeling that this really should have been like a 10-episode miniseries, where each of these protest movements is only just condensed to like a little 10-minute chunk, and then we have to move on to the next protest movement, and we are not really getting an in-depth examination of any of the issues that motivated these movements, except we are getting somewhat of a picture of a protest movement which is just building, and to a certain extent, a protest movement which is looking for a cause. And that is interesting. That in the initial stages, the protest movements are building on each other. So the House on Un-American Activities Committee, I believe by 1960, had become unpopular nationwide. So this was McCarthy's committee, but this was after the fall of McCarthy. So I believe this was just kind of a shell of the former movement, the House on Un-American Activities Committee movement, but had become hated and unpopular by this time, and it had become fashionable to protest it. And then the civil rights movement, which is somewhat carrying off the momentum of that, and also the fact that the civil rights movement going on in the American South. leads directly into the Berkeley free speech movement because the university was trying to crack down on political expression, in part because of the civil rights movement organizing going on. And then that all that energy brought up by the Berkeley free speech movement goes very smoothly into the Vietnam War protest movement, because you have a group of idealistic young people all there, and you've got this horrible war. Sorry, the camera fell over. I don't really have a professional setup here. I just place my phone on the bookshelf and prop it up with some books. As you can probably tell, this is not a very professional operation I've got going here. So we'll just count that as a little fun blooper that you can add to the experience of this video, and I'll just leave that in there, and I'll put these two parts of the video together in the editor. But yeah, as I was saying, the idealistic energy that was brought up by the Berkeley free speech movement does seem to go very, very smoothly into the anti-Vietnam war movement, because you've got all these idealistic young people who are already organized, already used to protesting, and then all of a sudden there's this terrible war that's going on. And as is clear in the documentary, I mean, the war had been building in Vietnam throughout the 60s, but nobody was really talking about it in the early 60s, in part because the American buildup was not substantial. But at this point, people were finally beginning to talk about the Vietnam War. But what's interesting, in which the documentary... An interesting issue which the documentary explores a little bit, but I think does not really attempt to fully explain, is it appears that within a couple years, the opposition to the Vietnam War is no longer the central issue. Instead, there is counterculture creating an alternative society. The whole hippie movement, which was, of course, the hippie movement was connected to the anti-war protests, but it was also this whole separate thing. And who knows? Maybe I'm just getting a false impression because the documentary makers diverted their attention to the hippie movement at this point in the documentary. And maybe that doesn't mean that the anti-war movement was getting diverted. Maybe that's just an illusion created by the documentary. But yeah, you do, as you're watching this, you're like, what's going on, guys? Don't forget about the Vietnam War. What are you doing with all these stupid hippie things? There's so much political work to be done. But you know, the hippie movement was a big thing in the 1960s, wasn't it? And then we get into the Black Panthers, which is in some ways just a continuation of the civil rights movement. But they make an interesting point that the Black Panthers had a very extreme image. And as one of the people on the documentary says, and I think this is a good point, the Panthers wanted to create an extreme image that was really more extreme than they really were, and the media helped them to create that image. And then the white radicals, who were maybe a little bit directionless by this time, were just completely captivated by that extreme image that the Black Panthers were putting out of a revolutionary vanguard, who were militant and had guns and were organized and were wearing berets, and just looked very cool. Now, one of the questions left hanging by this documentary is they make such a big deal about how the Black Panther movement in the Bay Area was really riling up the white radicals and making them more extreme. Um, but then they don't really explore where this went. Possibly because it's outside of the scope of the documentary. So, I mean, there was a militant offspring of the student radical group, the Weathermen. But at this point in time, I don't believe their main activities were in California, right? They were more in Chicago and Detroit and New York. Uh, as well, there will be radical militant groups in California during the 70s, Sudanese Liberation Army, etc., but that is outside of the scope of the documentary. So maybe that's why the documentary doesn't really explore where all this is going. They heavily hint that the Black Panther movement has captivated the imagination of the white student radicals and may lead them to further extremism, but we don't really see that. And then we get to People's Park movement, which is interesting because now the People's Park movement is something that until I saw this documentary, I never really knew what it was. I like I said, I was interested in the period, so I had heard it mentioned in some of the literature, like offhand references to it, but I'd never had an explainer on what the People's Park movement actually was. And this documentary is an excellent explainer on this little incident. It was a space of university land, which the university was not using at that time. It was just a parking lot, but which the university had plans to build on in the future, which the counterculture movement and the student radicals decided to turn into a park. And this was going to be People's Park. And so they were going to say, okay, you're not using this land, so we're going to take it back for the people and make a park. What's interesting, as is pointed out by a couple of the talking heads in this documentary, is the People's Park movement had an idealistic element to it, but it was also a search for confrontation where no confrontation existed previously. So it wasn't like we've got this horrible, unjust war we need to stop, or the black people are being mistreated, we need to stop that. They were just trying to find an issue for confrontation. And it was also interesting that this became an issue at a time when the bombing of Vietnam was still going on. And so again, as somebody watching the documentary, you're like, guys, don't forget about the Vietnam War. What are you doing getting distracted by this People's Park? And again, who knows how much of that is just me being misled by the focus of the documentary filmmakers. But yeah, it's interesting. On Wikipedia, they talk about the reception of this movie, and they give a quote from one of the critics who said, by the end of this movie, you can see, by the end of this documentary, you can see that the protest itself had become sort of an addictive narcotic. He implies that it's something that happened near the end of the decade. Although I think as this documentary shows, it's something that was right there from the beginning. Right in the early days of the 1960s, before the Vietnam War movement and before the student movement, these little protests against the House Un-American Activities Committees were attracting people who saw these protests in Berkeley and were attracted to that protest movement. But certainly, there's no denying, and all the talking heads in the documentary say it themselves, that by the end of the 60s, they were just looking to keep the energy alive any way they could. And it was less about a focused political movement with objectives, which again is a pity, because there were political issues around. The Vietnam War was still going on. So again, why didn't they focus more on that? But yeah, all in all, just a very fascinating documentary. At the end, if you watch the end credits, they talk about in the end credits about just how much work it took to make this documentary, how many people supported it, how much funding they got, and it's just a reminder. When you watch a documentary, how much work it took to go through all that archival footage and pull out just the interesting clips needed to put together a really fascinating documentary. And that that work paid off. They went through, they found the interesting clips, they put them together, they made a really interesting documentary here. So it's something that's well worth watching. Yeah, I'll just leave it at that.